John Murray preached about universalism in a little chapel in New Jersey, bringing this new theology to the American colonies. Murray had been a fiery Calvinist preacher until he encountered the writings of James Raleigh, an English Universalist. Calvinist doctrine taught that all human beings were tainted by original sin and would all go to hell except for the elect, the few whom God chose and would send to heaven after their deaths. And how would you know if you were a member of the elect? Well, you would have an experience of God's grace telling you you were. And then you would join a Calvinist congregation, of course. Universalism arose to challenge this judgmental picture of divine favor and justice. Its adherents, like Raleigh and Murray, argued that the Bible clearly stated that God loved all human beings as we were all created in the divine image. Furthermore, God had not demanded Jesus' death on the cross in redemption for human sin. Rather, Jesus had been crucified because the people of his time misunderstood, even feared, his universalist message of God's unconditional love. Human beings were born beloved, already saved from eternal damnation. Murray, who had left Ireland to preach at the London Tabernacle, the center of British Calvinism, found himself deeply moved by this hopeful theology, and he began to preach the Universalist message. Soon, he found his life totally turned upside down, but not for the good. His wife and his child died of illness. He lost the support of his family and friends and colleagues over his newfound faith. Depressed, financially destitute, and facing debtor's prison, he fled England for the American colonies, boarding a ship to New York. But even that did not go as planned. A storm drove the ship into a sandbar along the coast of New Jersey. Murray and a couple of his shipmates were instructed by the captain to go ashore to find supplies. And there Murray happened upon a farmhouse owned by Thomas Potter. Potter invited Murray for dinner, where he learned his story, and Potter was delighted. A Universalist himself, he had built a little chapel 10 years previously in the woods of his land, and he was just waiting for a Universalist preacher to come. He begged Murray to preach for him, and his family and his friends, convinced that God had steered Murray to him for this purpose. Murray was less convinced and agreed to do so only if the winds hadn't shifted by Sunday, much like Mary Poppins. Well, the winds did not change, and Murray was still stuck. As promised, he preached his Universalist sermon in this little chapel, which Potter would later name Murray's Grove, and it is still a Universalist retreat and study center. Then the winds did shift, and Murray boarded his ship for New York and eventually ended up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where he started the first Universalist congregation in the New World. Universalist congregations began to pop up all over New England as people were moved by its hopeful message and its spirited revivalist worship. It reached its height of popularity in the early 1800s under the leadership of its most popular and prolific theologian, Hosea Ballou, one of my favorite guys. Hosea was an ultra-universalist, as opposed to Murray, who was a restorationist universalist, because we all fight no matter what. And the most common critique of universalism by other Christian denominations was its positive assessment of human nature. Why would people act morally if they knew they were going to be saved no matter what? They asked, Universalists, what would keep human beings from hedonism and sin if there was no threat of divine punishment? And how did Universalists explain the reality of evil in human nature if there was no such thing as original sin? Restorationist Universalists like Murray responded to these critiques by saying that all souls would first have to abide in a kind of liminal waiting room until they had seen the light and been restored to God. Only then would they enter heaven. The ultra-universalists like Ballou, however, believed that God's unconditional love was so beautiful and so powerful that even the most unrepentant sinner, when they came face to face with God, would see the depth of this divine love and immediately reconcile and be cleansed of all wickedness. Furthermore, those people who recognized and accepted this divine love in this life would not be moved to sin, quite the opposite. They would be moved to love their neighbors as God loved them, and to work to create the reign of God on earth. Sin was not caused by human depravity, argued these Universalists, but a tolerance to the misalignment with love. As Ballou argued, love is the life and happiness of the soul, and hatred is its death and misery. God did not need to use fear to control human behavior, for who would choose misery if they knew such joyful love? While modern Unitarian Universalism has transcended our original Christian beliefs regarding sin and God and the afterlife, we can see the influence of this Universalist theology in our newly revised UUA covenant. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love with a capital L. I've always resonated with our Universalist tradition. I am a theist in that I do trust in a larger presence of love that I think holds us from underneath, calling us back from fear and hate to the true longing of our souls to love and be loved, to belong to one another, to the earth, and to our source of being, however we name or understand that source. I trust, as Rebecca Parker writes, that even when our hearts are broken by our own failure or the failure of others, even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is a universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will. That said, there have been times over the generations when that universalist faith in a larger spirit of love has been severely challenged. Universalism's number shrank during the Civil War, and the denomination began to disappear altogether after World War II, as the worst of our humanity revealed itself, and God's love seemed distant, if not absent. Its optimistic trust in the goodness of God's love found a partner in Unitarianism's optimistic trust in the goodness of human nature. And Universalism merged with Unitarianism in 1961, in part to ensure its own survival. Given the optimism of our Universalist and Unitarian heritages, we can see why our tradition has struggled with what to do and what to say about evil. If we trust that God's nature, that human nature, for the nature of the universe is grounded in goodness, grounded in love, grounded in life, if we reject the notion that human nature is inherently sinful, or that the divine's relationship with humanity is primarily one of judgment, then we might see evil as a dramatic and foolish concept left over from a more superstitious time. We do talk about injustice and oppression in our call for justice and liberation, but we rarely, if ever, name them as sinful and evil. Occasionally, though, events challenge us to face the reality of sin and evil. I remember after 9/11, many Unitarian Universalist ministers, including me, found ourselves having to preach on this topic as questions arose from our congregants. And now we're watching our country's democracy being dismantled, while the painfully slow, still unfinished work of building equality in our country that has been engaged around race and gender and sexual orientation and class and all the other diverse expressions of our humanity, that equality is being violently and gleefully undone. Worse, this dismantling and destruction is being perpetrated blasphemously, in my opinion, in the name of God. I am finding it easier and easier to believe that evil is real, which leaves me struggling. How do we as Unitarian Universalists talk about evil, and how do we counter it in the context of our Unitarian Universalist faith centered on love? Can we trust love as the center of our faith in times like these? It's hard in part, I think, because our understanding of justice and love don't always sit comfortably together, especially if we expect justice to mean that people who do bad and harmful things are held accountable, even punished. Or if we expect that we can reason them into goodness, into seeing what we see. As Ashley Horan notes, history shows that those who intentionally wield their power to dominate and degrade other humans are very unlikely to have a sui generis crisis of conscience and repent their misdeeds. We want fairness, we want accountability, rather than denying or minimizing its existence. And such faith requires spiritual depth and courage. First, because we must accept that evil exists, that it's not a superhuman demonic force beyond us, but the result of us human beings using or accommodating violence and hatred against one another in words and in deeds, individually and systemically. That we allow our lives and our souls to become misaligned with love. Second, we need to recognize that this love we speak of is not a feeling. It's not a feeling. It is a spiritual practice and a religious commitment. Universalism does not require us individually to love every other human being, writes Horan, but it does demand that we behave in ways that do not dehumanize or degrade our enemies, even as we actively resist them and strategically work toward a world in which all people can access the freedom and flourishing that love wills for each and all of us. How do we find the courage to trust in a larger spirit of love with the same joy